going to continue our course. This is lecture number 10. In this lecture we are going to start chapter number 8. In the introduction we are going to talk about linguistic variation and social class, and we will discuss topics like accent and dialect, and we are going to discuss the difference between them. Accent and dialect as a clue to social information. We will also deal with the questions something like, does social class really affect language? And we will consider the problem of defining social class. We will also deal with research into the relationship between social class and language. We will discuss some experiment done by William Labov, Peter Trugel, and William Ann Kurzweil. So in the introduction of this chapter, we need to understand that a given language is not used in exactly the same way by every one of its speakers. People differ in the way they speak. Even if they share the same language, everybody would use the language in a different way that express his social class. So a given language is not used in exactly the same way by everybody. This variation of using language can be caused by a number of things, and one of those things is class, which refers to social class. There is a connection between a person's social class and the linguistic variety that they use. So the language that you speak is related to the social class to which you belong, and both of them affect one another. So we can decide your social class by considering the language variety that you use. Linguistic variation and social class. A discussion is related to the difference between accent and dialect. We always hear those two terms, but we need to understand the difference between them. The term accent refers to the features of a speaker's pronunciation. So we can realize that the pronunciation of this speaker has a different accent, has a specific accent that can signal their regional or social background. Sometimes we can know that this person has come from this city or that city because he speaks this accent, because his language shows a specific accent related to a certain geographical area. The pronunciation of words is associated with a certain geographical area. So the term accent has to do with pronunciation. It has nothing to do with the grammar. It has nothing to do with structure. It has nothing to do with vocabulary, but it has to do with the way we pronounce the word. Sometimes, as we said, we can know that this person has come from Riyadh, this person has come from Mecca, because he uses the accent of Mecca, the accent that distinguishes this geographical area, distinguishes the people who are living in this geographical area. For example, in English, the word water is pronounced as wa'a in Cockney accent, but it is pronounced normally as water in London. So if somebody says, I want a cup of water, give me a glass of water, but not water. So we can realize that this person has come from the city called Cockney in the UK. What about dialect? How dialect is different from accent? The term dialect refers to a variety of language that can signal the speaker's regional or social background, and the main point is that unlike accent, which differ only in a pronunciation, dialects differ in their grammatical structure. So to distinguish the dialect of the person, you will find that his dialect or his variety of language has certain grammatical structures that are different from another. It has nothing to do with the pronunciation. We said pronunciation has to do with accent, but grammar has to do with dialect. So my dialect is different from a different person's dialect because I use a different grammatical structure. My accent is different from another person's accent because my pronunciation is different. So accent has to do with the pronunciation, and dialect has to do with grammar or grammatical structure. Let's have an example. In the United States, they use the question, do you have, but in the UK they say, have you got, for example, do you have a house? This is a typical question in the United States. But in English or in the United Kingdom, they use a different grammatical structure saying, have you got a house? So there is a difference in the grammatical structure. Sometimes the difference is also in vocabulary, because in the United States they say sidewalk instead of pavement, which is the word used in the UK. So dialect has to do with the grammatical structure, has to do with the vocabulary, but accent has to do with the way we pronounce the word. And we remember the example of water. People in London, for example, say water, but in Cockney they say water, water. Accent and dialect, a clue to social information. As we said, we can know the social class of some people depending on the accent or dialect they say. We have an example taken from the literature. Hamlet. In Hamlet, a Shakespearean play, Shakespeare makes some clear linguistic distinction between the lowly grave diggers and Prince Hamlet through their use of language. So when somebody speaks, we can know that whether he is a poor person, whether he has come from a high class or a middle class, or we can know whether he is an educated person, is he a highly educated person, depending on the language that he used, depending on the variety of the language that he used. So Shakespeare wants us to realize that the variety of language used by gravedigger is very much different from the variety of language used by a prince, a highly educated person, which is the main character of the play, Hamlet. So he says, the gravediggers, members of the lower social class, speak in prose. They do not speak in poetry. They do not say words with rhythm. They do not use poetic language. They use prose, normal language, that is ordinary speech, speech that everybody speaks. They do not speak verse, which is spoken by the character of the high social class or the higher social standing class. While if we consider the language used by Hamlet's speech is much more poetic than the language or than the variety of language that is used by gravediggers. Such poetic language suggests that a character like Hamlet is a highly educated character. It has come from a highly educated background, and it is superior, socially superior in position. So we can realize the social class of the person from the language he used. And the example that Shakespeare gave us is when he compares the language of Hamlet with the language of gravedigger. And we said gravediggers do not use poetry when they speak. They use normal language, they use normal speech, while Hamlet, a highly educated person, would use poetry in his language, which suggests that he is a highly educated person. He does not use street language. He would use a language which has poetic influence, which has some poetic reference, which has some rhythm. It is not an everyday speech. It is not street language. It is language of educated people. Then we move to the question of, does social class really affect our language? Is our language affected whether we are coming from a poor class, from a working class, or from a high class? Well, the answer to this question, according to the author of our book, is yes. Social class affects language. How this is affected? Now, the higher a person is on the social class, if you are very rich, if you have come from a highly prestigious social class, this means the more the speech will reflect prestigious norm. The more we will notice that your language, the variety of language that you use, will reflect that you have come from a higher social class. So according to this author, the higher a person is on the social scale, the more their speech will reflect prestige norms. And we said prestige norms refer to the language, the standard language, the language used by people who have come from a high social class. Secondly, speakers at the top of the social scale, those who come from a high social class, speak standard English. They do not use everyday English. They do not use street English. They use standard English with very little regional variation. When you listen to them, you cannot say that this person has come from London. You cannot say that this person has come from Cockney. You cannot say that he has come from the south of UK or north of UK. You cannot realize the city that he has come from through his language. While some people, their language is affected by the accent of their regional area, the geographical area they live in. Let us consider the following example where we can distinguish whether this sentence is reflecting some social class or not. A sentence like, he's a man who likes his wife, or he's a man that likes his wife. Now both sentences are considered standard English sentences. Now if you consider another variation of those two sentences, you will notice that the people who speak those sentences has come from a different social class. They have a social class which is not the highest on the scale of social class. So if I consider those examples, he's a man that likes his wife. Well, this is not standard English. He's a man as likes his wife. Well, there are people who say this, but this reflects that they do not really they have not been educated highly. They did not go to universities. They are not really highly educated people. So they say sentences similar to those. He's a man what likes his wife. Again, there are some varieties of English which do not pay attention to the use of relative clauses or connectors or any grammatical aspect of the language that the person speaks. There are people also who says he's a man likes his wife to mean that he's a man that likes his wife. So the higher you are on the social class, the more prestigious norms, the more standard English that you are expected to talk. This again supports the idea that social class affects language. Our social class is affecting the language that we use. If we come from a poor social class, this shows that our language is not an educated language. It is more or less similar to street English, or the language that everybody uses outside the educated area, or they use in an formal context. So we are still with the same question, but we have an example coming from words. If you consider those words, which all of them refer to the toilet, an educated person or a person who has come from a highly social class would say WC, or he would say lavatory or toilet. Those words, all of them refer to the same thing, and all are acceptable in standard English, and all refer to the same thing. But a person who is from a poor social class, who is probably of a lower social class, would say words that reflect his social class. For example, instead of saying WC or instead of saying toilet, he would say bog, or he would say lav, or he would say brivy. Sometimes he used dunny or even don. So those terms reflect that he is uneducated, reflect the social class he has come from. So there are some non-standard words which are equivalent to the standard one, so which also refer to the same thing, but through the use of those words we can realize that this person or that person has come from a social class which is not a highly social class, which is not an educated person, or a person who has never been to schools or to universities, for example. The problem of defining social class, well, we do not really have an exact definition of what a social class is, but we can realize social class by studying the structures, the characteristics of social class in general. For example, social class can be divided into three. For example, we have upper social class, middle social class, and lower social class. We expect that upper social class are highly educated people who use standard English, while lower social class are people who use a language which is not the standard. They use a language that can tell us what geographical area they have come from. And middle social class is something in between. They use a language which is neither standard nor non-standard. It is almost in between. Again, one of the characteristics of social class is that it is not easy to differentiate members of one social class from those of another. There are some factors which can sometimes determine the specific class that people belong to. I can know that you belong to high social class or to upper social class depending on education, depending on occupation, and depending on some economic factor. The education that you had, is it a good education? Is it a university level education? And the type of job that your occupation, what job you do, is it a good job? Is it a respected job? Are you a doctor? Are you a plumber? Are you a teacher? Are you a cleaner, for example? Those type of jobs which are associated with lower class people, or people who has come from a lower social class, like cleaners and those jobs like servants and stuff like this. And we can judge your social class depending on the economic factors, on how much money you, for example, you earn, and whether you have a well-paid job, a job which gives you a good salary. Then we move to the problem of defining social class, because as we said, we do not have an exact definition of social class. We study the characteristics of the social class so that we can understand what social class really means. There are some problems where some people equate social class with money, that if you have a large amount of money, this means that you are of an upper social class. Well, this is not always true, because the main problem with equating social class with money is that it is not always that the middle classes that have the money. Well, some people sometimes they are of a lower class, but they earn a large amount of money depending on the type of job they use or they do. So you cannot say that if you have a good amount of money or a large sum of money, this means that you are of a middle class or that you are of an upper class. This is a problem if we equate money with social class, which is not always true. The main problem with equating social class with education, that you cannot also say if this person has got a PhD or this person has graduated from this university or that university, this means that he is of an upper social class. Well, this is another problem, because if you are highly educated, this does not always mean that you are of an upper social class. So the main problem with equating social class with education is that it is entirely possible that an individual who is a middle class person might not earn more than an average amount of money, and therefore he will not be able to pay for the university, he will not have the money to pay his tuition fees. So it is also a problem, or if we equate, if we think of a person, if he is educated, this means that he is of a middle class. If he is not educated, he is of a lower class. This is not always true, because some people do not even have the money to pay for the universities they study in, and at the same time they belong to, say, a lower class or to a middle class. So it is not always possible to say that social class is affected by money, or social class is affected by the degree or the education that you had. There is a report which tried to classify the social class of people depending on the type of job they do. This report was published in 1997, and it proposed a new classification for social class based on occupation, based on the job that we do. At the top scale, at the top social class, the highest social class, which we call class 1, is professors and senior managers, those who are managers of companies, and doctors, lawyers, and teachers. This is considered that people who hold those positions, people who do those professions, people who work as professionals, people who work as professors and senior managers and doctors, lawyers, and teachers, all of them considered of an upper class people. If we have people who are associate professionals and junior managers, or even nurses and social workers, those are not of a high social class. They are a little bit lower than upper social class. They are not really high class people. They are not of a high class people. If we look at the end of this report, we will find people classed as number 8, which are people who are unemployed. So if you are unemployed, if you do not have any job, this means you are poor, this means you do not have source of money, and it also means that you are of a lower social class, because job will help you build a social class of a certain status, whether middle class or lower class. So again, this report depends on the profession, on the job, on the occupation that a person does. The occupations, the type of jobs like professionals and managers and doctors are of an upper social class. People who work elementary jobs like laborers, waiters, or cleaners, or even those who are unemployed, are people usually have a lower social class. According to this report, the further down the scale you go, the less well paid the job seems to be. So again, if you go down this report to class number 8, you will find that the further down the scale you go, the less well paid. There is no good paid job. Nobody is paying you a lot of money for being a cleaner. You will not earn a large amount of money because you work as a waiter or as a waitress. So the further down you go on the social scale, the less well paid the job seems to be. And quite the opposite, the more money a person earns, the higher up the social scale they are. So if they earn a large amount of money because they work as managers, because they work as doctors, they work as professionals, so the more money those people earn, the higher up, or the upper class they belong to. So the higher up the social class they are. We again go back to the same problem of why it is difficult to define social class, why we do not have an exact definition of social class. Some of the jobs included in the lower division of this report can actually provide a fairly high income. So such as the plumber, a person who does water tube and taps and works as a plumber. So those people, though their job is considered a low job, a lower class people job, plumbers can have a comparatively high income because they can work a lot and they can earn a large amount of money. So it is very difficult to always define social class, because you cannot always classify people depending on the amount of money they earn, because a low class people excuse me, a low class a person can sometimes earn a comparatively high income. Similarly, some of the occupations listed in this report shows that the higher class division, such as teachers and say doctors, those people, though sometimes classed as high class, but they do not always earn a large amount of money. So such as teaching jobs are not always the most well-paid occupation. So sometimes the society will classify a doctor as a high-class person or a person who has an upper social class, depending on the money that he earns. But we can find a lot of teachers who does not earn a lot of money. Those teachers or those doctors will not earn a large amount of money. So it is very difficult to say that all doctors have come from an upper social class, because earning money does not always depend on the type or the kind of the occupation or the kind of job that you do. Research into the relationship between language and social class. As we said, we have some experiment by Labov, Trugel and Kurzweil, who has done some research on the relationship between language and social class. We are going to consider their experiment briefly. For example, William Labov studied the social stratification of the R sound in New York City, and this American social linguist conducted a study of the relationship between social class and linguistic variation in New York City. He studied the linguistic variation in 3 department stores. One is an upper class store, another is a middle class store, and a third is a lower class department store. Labov wanted to find out whether the presence or absence of a pronounced R in sounds such as mother, herd, and sugar was determined by a speaker's social class. First of all, we need to understand that pronouncing the R sound in the United States would reflect a high-class person. So he went to 3 department stores. Each one belonged to a different social class, high, middle, and low, and he wanted to know whether the people there, the people who work as cashiers, for example, are they pronouncing the R sound? If yes, this means that this department store is of a high class. If not, it means that it is of a low or a middle class. So according to Labov, he found that the higher the social class of the speaker, the more instances, the more examples of post-vocalic R they would use. Post-vocalic means they really pronounce the sound R at the end of words like mother, father, sugar, etc. This means that there is a relation between social class and language. So what he found, that people pronouncing R really belong to the department store which is in a high class area. The second experiment by Peter Trugel, who studied the social difference of English in Norwich. Trugel's aim was to find out whether social factors played a part in the way that people of Norwich speak. Trugel's research depends on creating situation of varying formality. Then he tests whether his informants will use formal style, less formal style, or casual style. According to him, he found that the higher a person's social class, the closer to the prestige variety their speech would be. Again, this shows that there is a relation between social class and the variety we use. In other words, the higher the social class of the speaker, the closer their speech is to the prestige variety. And prestige variety is the variety which is used by people who has come from an upper class. The final experiment is by William and Kurzweil, who studied dialect leveling in 3 Britain towns. William and Kurzweil studied the accent of adolescents in 3 British towns, in Hull, Milton Keynes and Reading. The 3 towns differ in their social composition. One is high class, one is middle class, and third one is a low class city. So data were collected from 96 speakers through individual interviews, through a discussion with pair of a speaker, a group discussion. So this is the way they collected the data. This is the way they considered the language those speakers use. Depending on, they make individual interviews for those people, they interview the speakers, they make discussion with a pair of speakers, or they bring a group of those people and try to elicit discussion, and depending on the language they use, they can judge. What did they find? William and Kurzweil found that the accent of the 3 towns were converging, leveling, or becoming more like one another, alike. They look similar, but they also found some class-based differences in pronouncing the vowel sounds of some vowels. They found some class-based differences in the shift to the consonant patterns of UST English, which is a city in the UK. For example, the glottalization of the T in butter. The T sound in butter is pronounced at the glottis, pu'ar, and the replacement of the F sound with F or V. So instead of saying fan, they say van, for example. So again, this reflects the relationship between social class and linguistic variation. Just to make it very easy for you, those experiments are trying to tell us that our class, the social class that we have come from, is affected by the language that we use. Or the other way around, the language that we speak is affected by the social class to which we belong. This brings us to the end of this lecture. Thank you very much.